and welcome. This is CNN Max, streaming 24/7. I'm Abby Phillip, and welcome to special coverage of Donald Trump's hush money trial. Today, the prosecution and defense both used their opening statements to set out very different versions of what happened before the 2016 election. The prosecution argued that Donald Trump organized a criminal conspiracy to cover up his affair with adult film actress Stormy Daniels. His goal, they say, was to influence the 2016 election. Now, the defense said that Donald Trump is innocent, that a non-disclosure agreement is perfectly legal, and that Trump never sought to hide the payments that he made to cover up the affair. Now, tomorrow, the first witness will be David Pecker, and he'll continue on the stand to explain his role in this alleged hush money scheme. I'll break down all of this with my panel of experts, and we'll also be taking a look at Trump's mindset as he faces yet another major legal challenge. But first, CNN's Kara Scannell was in the courtroom all day today. She has a lot more on what happened.
Opening statements and the first witness, a former tabloid executive, front and center Monday as the first criminal trial of Donald Trump officially got underway.
President Trump, how are you today?
I think it went very well.
Prosecutors said the case boils down to a conspiracy and cover-up, that Trump orchestrated a scheme to corrupt the 2016 presidential election and covered it up by lying in his business records. Assistant District Attorney Matthew Colangelo saying it was election fraud, pure and simple. Trump attorney Todd Blanche argued the former president is innocent. The payments made were legal. Blanche also claimed there is nothing wrong with trying to influence an election. In his remarks, Colangelo, a lead prosecutor on the case, said the alleged crimes began at an August 2015 meeting between Trump, Cohen, and ex-National Enquirer publisher David Pecker, the first witness to testify in the trial on Monday. Colangelo said the three formed a conspiracy at that meeting to influence the presidential election by concealing negative information about Mr. Trump in order to help him get elected. The prosecution said Pecker agreed to help buy damaging information on Trump to make it go away, a move known as catch and kill. At the center of the case, a $130,000 payment to adult film star Stormy Daniels just weeks before Election Day in 2016. The prosecution said a sexual infidelity, especially with a porn star on the heels of the Access Hollywood tape, would have been devastating to his campaign. So at Trump's direction, Cohen negotiated the deal to buy Daniels' story to prevent it from becoming public before the election. Trump has denied having an affair with Daniels. Prosecutors said Trump did not want to write the check himself, so Cohen put up the money. Colangelo argued Trump, Cohen, and former Trump Organization CFO Alan Weisselberg agreed Cohen would be paid back in monthly installments through fake invoices to the Trump Organization. Prosecutors said key witnesses like Cohen have made mistakes in the past and encouraged the jury to keep an open mind and carefully evaluate all of the evidence that corroborates Michael Cohen's testimony. Then it was Trump's attorney's turn. Blanche said the DA's office should never have brought this case. He said the prosecution's story is not true and the jury will find plenty of reasonable doubt. He pivoted to paint Trump as a husband and father, saying he's a person just like you and just like me. Trump's team suggested the payments Trump made to Cohen were not a payback for funds paid to Stormy Daniels, but instead payments to his personal attorney. Trump defended himself against these charges after court on Monday.
He puts in an invoice or whatever, a bill, and they pay and they call it a legal expense. I got indicted for that.
Blanche shifted blame to Cohen, saying the reality is Mr. Trump is not on the hook, is not criminally responsible for something Mr. Cohen may have done years after the fact. Blanche said the prosecution's outline of a supposed catch-and-kill deal with Pecker was not a scheme, but completely irrelevant and not illegal. In the afternoon, as Pecker briefly took the stand, he did not look at Trump, but Trump looked directly at him as he testified. Kara Scannell, CNN, New York.
Thanks for that, Kara Scannell. Here with me to break down all of this and the prosecution's opening statements are former Assistant Special Watergate Prosecutor Nick Ackerman, trial attorney Kelly Hyman, Jessica Washington, she's a senior reporter at The Root, and CNN legal analyst and former federal prosecutor Jennifer Rogers. Nick, I want to start with you. The prosecution, they set out their main thesis, which was that this was a conspiracy to basically defraud the American public. How do you think that they did in setting that up?
Oh, I think they set it up very well. They described exactly what their theory is. That is, that they lied. The whole thing was one lie after another, as the assistant district attorney said, to hide and conceal what was valuable information to the voting public. That if they had known about this prior to the election, particularly on the heels of the Access Hollywood tape, that Trump may well have never been elected president. So what you really are setting up here is a conspiracy to defraud the American voters, to keep them from knowing material information that would have made a difference in this election.
And Jennifer, the response from Trump's attorney, Todd Blanche, was, I have a spoiler alert. There is nothing wrong with trying to influence an election. It's called democracy. Is there any truth to that?
Well, it's a great line, Abby. I mean, it's been repeated dozens and dozens of times on shows like this one, so he got a good one there in terms of repeat value. But the problem is, sure, there's nothing wrong with doing innocuous things to try to influence an election, like saying, please vote for me, I'm the best candidate. But when you do something illegal, like under New York law, enter into a conspiracy to improperly influence an election, or under federal law, to take something as a campaign benefit, for example, the silence of someone which is worth $130,000, you can't do that if it's given by a corporation because the amount is too high, and you can't do that if you don't declare it as part of your paperwork that you have to file with the federal election authorities. So, you know, you can try to influence people as long as you don't do anything illegal, but once you do, and there are a couple of ways that this was illegal, that's when it's not just democracy, it's a crime.
I know Nick's ears will perk up when I say this, but I think the thesis here is it's the cover-up, not the crime. That is the crime here for Trump, potentially. Kelly, there was also some discussion here preemptively by prosecutors about a key witness who will be likely coming up here, Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen is Trump's former lawyer. He's a key principal in this alleged scheme. But he has some credibility issues, I guess you could say. I mean, if you're the prosecutors, you're going to be focusing on that, and they did, and we'll get to that in a second. But the defense were focusing on that. But the prosecutors, here's what they told the jury: keep an open mind, carefully evaluate the evidence that Michael Cohen presents. And they noted that it's all being corroborated. Do you think that they did enough, Kelly, to really deal with this issue preemptively when it comes to what kind of witness Michael Cohen can be for their case?
Michael Cohen is going to be key to this case because he can connect the dots and connect the T's. And I think it was very smart for them to bring it up initially, to first discuss this matter, to say, hey, listen, has been some issues in the past. He's done this. But what he's saying on the stand. We also have to remember now, once Michael Cohen takes the stand, if he does lie, then he could potentially be charged with perjury, which is a crime, if he doesn't tell the truth once he testifies in this case.
Nick, just real quick, I mean, you've talked so much about your experience in Watergate and the similarities between what Trump is facing now and what Nixon faced then. As it relates to Michael Cohen, can you connect those dots here for our audience?
Well, it's very simple. I mean, there was a cover-up in the Watergate. Nixon was trying to keep the voting public in the 1972 election, when he was running for re-election, from learning about the connection between the Watergate burglary and the Nixon White House. And Nixon, in the course of that, authorized $1 million in hush money to be paid to the Watergate burglars. No different than what Trump did here in authorizing hush money payments to keep information from the voting public about his affairs with various people. So it's really the same, and the people that were at the center of both of these were each of those people's president's lawyers. It was John Dean for Donald Trump and Michael Cohen for Donald Trump and John Dean for Nixon. They both lied about what they did beforehand. They then told the truth, and they were the ones that testified against each of these people, although Nixon never went to trial because he ultimately was pardoned by Gerald Ford.
Yeah. Jessica, it's not lost on me that Donald Trump, actually, if you know anything about him, he kind of idolizes Richard Nixon, and he's probably among some people on the right who kind of want to revisit what happened with Nixon, this might be his opportunity in this case. This is going to all get litigated again. But the key part for Trump about all of this is the Access Hollywood tape. I mean, this is the key piece of information that preceded this attempt to silence Stormy Daniels effectively. And the prosecution brought that up today. They read the words from that Access Hollywood tape. They were not allowed to play it, but they read those words. The prosecutor, Matthew Colangio, said, those are Donald Trump's words. How significant is that tape when it comes to making the case about what the intent was here for Donald Trump?
Yeah. I mean, I think that tape is incredibly important. It's hard for us to remember now because so much has happened. Donald Trump has obviously lost in the civil case with E. Jean Carroll. And so that's obviously, incredibly important, and yet that hasn't moved the needle politically. But that Access Hollywood tape was a real moment where we did see people turn against Trump. And obviously he went on to continue to have support. But I do think bringing that tape back up, trying to remind people of just how important that moment was politically for Trump, I think that's going to be key in their case.
Jennifer, do you think that it matters at all whether Trump may or may not have wanted to hide it from his family versus hide it from the American public? Do you think that comes into play here in this case?
It does, because if the jury believes that the reason that he did this had nothing to do with the election and only had to do with hiding it from his family, didn't want to sully his reputation, didn't want to ruin the brand, et cetera, then he wouldn't be guilty here, or he would be guilty potentially of the false filings, but not of the bump up for the election crimes that actually makes it a felony. That would make it very similar to what ultimately happened in the John Edwards case. Remember, John Edwards was charged with campaign finance violations for paying off a mistress effectively. And what ended up happening is the jury decided that it wasn't beyond a reasonable doubt that it was about the election. Instead, it was about embarrassing his wife and his family and so on. The difference is the timing here is so different. That was way out in front of the election. There really wasn't evidence that it was specifically about the election. Here, Trump has to contend with all of the evidence, the timing, right after the Access Hollywood tape, as was just being discussed, and even having conversations around, well, why don't we wait to pay her until after the election, and then who cares? It doesn't matter.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that just the sheer timing of it really strongly suggests that was the primary motivation for those payments. So everyone, stick around. We have a lot more to discuss. We just heard about the prosecution's case, but we'll delve in a little bit more to what Trump's lawyers had to say to the jury as they sat down to open up this case. The simple assertion at the center of the defense's case, we'll get to that next.
Beyonce's new album is breaking records.
Every weekday morning, CNN's 5 Things has what you need to get going with your day. It's the 5 essential stories of the morning in 5 minutes or less.
CNN's 5 Things with Kate Baldwin, streaming weekdays exclusively on Max.
Whoa, let me back up for a minute.
It's beautiful. Wow. Look at this.
What I do for my art.
That's good, man.
Whoa, let me back up for a minute.
More salsa!
We do this for real.
We've heard all the pundits, seen all the hot takes, and read all the headlines. But what's it like to hear from the people actually living the news? I'm Audie Cornish, longtime journalist, and my CNN podcast will break down trending stories, the debates rocking our culture, and talk to the people living the headlines. I've got a lot of questions.
The Assignment with Audie Cornish. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
There is no media personality, businesswoman, celebrity chef like her.
The Many Lives of Martha Stewart.
now streaming on Max.
This is an incredible story.
The stakes were extremely high.
I believe you are the Son of God.
His election is an earthquake.
He transcends the church.
I have chosen to stay and fight.
He said, I'm not getting in this to lose.
The sky was the limit.
On the Chasing Life podcast, Dr. Sanjay Gupta goes inside the world of weight loss, the new miracle drugs, and what weight really tells us about our health. Chasing Life with Dr. Sanjay Gupta. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
You are not broken.
They just need a place to be heard.
The people who may not have a loud voice, nevertheless have an important story to tell. And there's a responsibility in telling their stories accurately. There is hope. Their trust in me means everything.
Much more now on Donald Trump's hush money trial. Today, Trump's defense attorneys used their opening statements to say that Donald Trump was innocent and that election influence is not a crime. It's actually part of a regular democracy. They told the jury that being in a non-disclosure agreement with Stormy Daniels was perfectly legal and that any allegations of an affair was an attempt to embarrass Trump. His defense team also tried to humanize their client to the court, saying that Donald Trump was only trying to protect his family. Finally, they also tried to discredit key witnesses, Michael Cohen, saying that his financial livelihood depends on President Trump's destruction. Our reporters in the court say that when Trump's attorney began their opening statements today, the former president's demeanor suddenly changed, and he turned to face them, watching them very closely. My panel is back with me now. Kelly, you know, I wonder about Michael Cohen again. I mean, this is the argument that Trump's lawyers are making. They say that he is basically obsessed with Trump. Quote, his financial livelihood depends on President Trump's destruction. You cannot make a serious decision about President Trump relying on the words of Michael Cohen. To an extent, Michael Cohen has had his entire life destroyed by being in Trump's orbit, by being associated with this and other aspects of Trump misdeeds or alleged misdeeds. If you're a member of the jury, I mean, don't you have to take that seriously?
You have to take everything into account, but I think the key is his credibility. Once he takes the witness stand, is he credible? What he says, is it believable? Is he telling the truth? Is what he's saying make sense? And that is ultimately going to be up to the jury based on the facts and evidence, whether they believe him or not of what transpired. And as I stated before, he is definitely key. He's definitely key for the state, and also it's key for the defendant to attack him and go against his credibility.
Nick, we discussed a little bit about this idea that influencing the election in and of itself is, according to Trump's attorneys, they're claiming that it's not a crime. But the aspect of this that I think the jury is going to have to deliberate on is the reimbursement to Michael Cohen for making those payments. Break that down for us. How do you think they should look at the flow of money here and what the intent was for that money?
Well, there's two things you're talking about. When you're talking about influencing the election, you're talking about Donald Trump's motive. And that's one of the powerful things that the prosecutor's arguing here. But the motive does not necessarily make up an element of the crime. The crime is the falsification of the documents to actually cover up what he had done and cover up his lies. So what the real crime comes down to, the one with the elements that the jury has to decide, are whether or not the government has proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Donald Trump engaged in falsifying records to cover up what he had done. And I think the evidence is going to be pretty powerful here in terms of what Michael Cohen says, what the documents say, and in terms of this tape recording that exists that's going to let the jury hear Donald Trump talk about this in his own words, where Michael Cohen is setting up a phony corporation that's part of this cover-up. So I think it's going to be pretty hard for the jury not to buy into this entire story at the end, because it's not whether or not you just find Michael Cohen credible. The question is, what else in the trial, what else in the evidence supports what he says? What corroborates what he is telling the jury? And that's going to be David Pecker, that's going to be Hope Hicks, that's going to be other people at the National Enquirer, that's going to be a whole series of documents that the jury's going to hear. And most importantly, it's Donald Trump's own words on tape.
Yeah, Donald Trump is obviously a key part of this. What he said, what they have evidence of. I mean, Jennifer, I do wonder, this is always the case with Trump. It's going to be a question of, can they concretely establish what he knew, what he intended, what his mindset was? What kind of evidence, if you're prosecuting this case, what would be the evidence that you would really want to be able to present to the jury to establish that Trump did in fact know that this was going to this money was intended to try to cover up an attempt to withhold this information from the public?
Well, it's pulling together a lot of different pieces of evidence. We've heard over and over again kind of comparing Donald Trump to mob bosses and other folks who, tell you to do something without explicitly saying the words. They'll say, oh, he talks like a mob boss. You know what he wants, but he doesn't explicitly come out and say it. So sometimes you're having to use a little bit of inference, but it's these different pieces of information. It's the testimony of Michael Cohen. It's the testimony of David Pecker in their meetings. It's the fact that Donald Trump signed these checks. It's the fact, and the prosecutors pointed this out in the opening statements, that he didn't just reimburse Michael Cohen for the $130,000. He paid him more than double that, and the reason is that they had to cover not just the $130,000, but the taxes Michael Cohen would have to pay when they papered this over in a way to make it look like something other than it was. So you're kind of building all of these blocks to say, of course he knew. Here's how you know that he knew. It's his own words on tape and to witnesses, but it's also all of these actions as well.
Yeah, that's a key part. I mean, if there's anything that people might remember about this kind of money paper trail, it's that it wasn't just the $130,000. They tried to make it seem as if they were paying him for more than that, but it was really because Michael Cohen was coming out of his pocket, then he had to pay taxes on that money that Trump was transferring to him, or the Trump organization was transferring to him. Jessica, one of the interesting parts about this opening salvo here in this case is that Trump's attorneys spent a lot of time trying to humanize him, perhaps as any defense attorney would for their client. Humanize him, make him seem more personable, make him seem at once like a larger-than-life figure, referring to him as Mr. President, referring to him as literally a larger-than-life figure, but then also suggesting that he's just like any other dad, he's just like any other husband, he's just like any other person who just wants to protect the emotions of his family. What do you think that did for the jury?
Yeah, I mean, that's always going to be incredibly important in any criminal or civil trial, is humanizing this person, particularly obviously in a criminal trial. I think with Trump, this is not someone who is known to the public, I would say, as a warm, cuddly person. And so I think the idea here, A, is to make him likable, but then B, to also say, this is a credible person, and compare him and contrast him to someone like Michael Cohen, who we already know the defense needs to denigrate in order to prove their point. So I definitely think their goal is to get the jury to side with Trump, but then also to kind of contrast him with Michael Cohen as this kind of anti-figure in this case.
On the same front, Nick, an interesting, we got some guidance from the judge here. If Trump were to take the stand, Judge Merchan ruled that he can be asked about certain other previous legal entanglements, among them the civil fraud verdict on property inflation that he just lost and had to pay a significant amount of money on. One of them is also the fact that he violated the gag order in that case twice and had fines to pay. The E. Jean Carroll lawsuit and that verdict in federal court. Also, the settlement that was reached by the New York AG to dissolve the Trump Foundation. When you look at that scope of potential issues that the jury can then be basically presented with if Trump were to take the stand, which do you think are the most important when it comes to establishing Trump? Yeah.
They're all important. They're all just devastating. There is no way, no how, that Donald Trump can take the witness stand. That is not going to happen here. He would be totally done in by just those facts alone, not to mention other facts that are going to come out in this trial. So I just don't see how he can possibly take the witness stand. If I were representing him, I would just keep him chained to the chair. There's no way he can do himself any good.
Well, he keeps insisting that he's going to take the stand. We'll see if that ever happens. Everyone, stick around. Much more ahead. He's the first witness to be called against Donald Trump. So who exactly is David Pecker? We'll take a closer look at the former tabloid publisher and his alleged role in this case. That'll be next.
There is no media personality, businesswoman, celebrity chef like her.
The Many Lives of Martha Stewart, now streaming on Max.
This is an incredible story.
The stakes were extremely high.
I believe you are the Son of God.
His election is an earthquake.
He transcends the church.
I have chosen to stay and fight.
He said, I'm not getting in this to lose.
The sky was the limit.
On the Chasing Life podcast, Dr. Sanjay Gupta goes inside the world of weight loss, the new miracle drugs, and what weight really tells us about our health. Chasing Life with Dr. Sanjay Gupta. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
You are not broken.
They just need a place to be heard.
The people who may not have a loud voice, nevertheless have an important story to tell. And there's a responsibility in telling their stories accurately. There is hope. Their trust in me means everything.
When we look back 100 years from now, we're going to say, this is where everything changed.
Hands in the sky. They can't do it like us.
We are talking about the revolution.
Music could make a difference.
The world fundamentally changed.
Clinton undermined himself.
America felt betrayed.
2010s have ushered in peak TV.
We keep moving too much. When the baby ain't no stopping. Keep your hands in the air, we keep on rocking.
Beyonce's new album is breaking records.
You ready?
Yeah, I can't wait.
Somebody asks you, what are you? Do people ask you that sometimes?
I would just say American.
I would imagine it's hot in these robes. You know what they say? Safety third.
I'm a disabled person, just like you're not a person with blackness.
I'm not trying to be confrontational. We're getting right into the details. I'm trying to be conversational.
Every weekday morning, CNN's 5 Things has what you need to get going with your day. It's the 5 essential stories of the morning in 5 minutes or less.
CNN's 5 Things with Kate Baldwin, streaming weekdays exclusively on Max.
The first witness called by the prosecution today was David Pecker. He is the former chairman of the National Enquirer's parent company, AMI. He was involved in numerous so-called catch-and-kill schemes at the Enquirer, which says that he orchestrated on behalf of his longtime friend, Donald Trump. Now, Pecker also allegedly helped broker this deal with adult film actress Stormy Daniels. CNN's Tom Foreman has more on just who David Pecker is.
More than just friends from back in the 90s, more than fellow New Yorkers on a quest for power and fame. David Pecker and Donald Trump were for decades a match made in media heaven. So how did it all come to this?
I don't think they even paid any money to that tabloid, okay? I don't think we made a payment to that tabloid. Nobody, except for me, would be looked at like this. Nobody.
For a long time, the relationship was good for both men. Trump gave Pecker's National Enquirer access to his fame. The tabloid gave him headlines. Trump catches Russia's White House spy. Trump must build the wall. Trump takes charge. The paper gave him its first endorsement ever for president. Trump returned the favor.
I've always said, why didn't the National Enquirer get the Pulitzer Prize for Edwards and O.J. Simpson and all of these things?
With slashing and burning enthusiasm, Pecker relentlessly posted false stories about political foes, while reportedly suppressing embarrassments for Trump, like the time First Lady Melania appeared to slap his hand away on a foreign trip. But those who studied the two men did not see an equal relationship.
Pecker really looked up to Donald Trump, still does, and he put his very important magazines to work for Donald Trump's interests.
Then some big names said Pecker went too far. In 2019, business mogul Jeff Bezos, for example, said Pecker threatened to release compromising photos of him unless Bezos publicly refuted claims that the Enquirer was improperly playing politics. Pecker's lawyers called it negotiation.
It absolutely is not extortion and not blackmail.
And thank you to Tom Foreman for that report. My panel is back with me. Kelly, what do you make of David Pecker being the very first person to testify in this case? Is he something of a linchpin to connect some of the dots that will be presented to the jury here?
He's setting the stage, so it's the state's obligation to prove their case, to prove every single element of their case, and they're starting back where they allege where it all began, with him, and this alleged conspiracy happened. So he's definitely key. Now we have to remember that he is testifying as a subpoena, so he is forced to be there, but he also has immunity. That means that whatever he says, that he cannot be charged with a crime. So definitely he is setting the stage and is another key witness for the state.
And Jennifer, catch and kill, not explicitly illegal, but again, I think it's worth explaining to people what is the connection that the prosecutor is going to have to make between the catch and kill scheme and what Donald Trump is alleged to have done that is illegal.
Well, Abby, it all starts with this meeting in 2015 with David Pecker and Donald Trump and others, where they basically say, all right, Trump is running for president. We need Pecker's help, right? We're going to lean on AMI and the National Enquirer to do a few things for us. And one of those things is to be the eyes and ears, to keep your eyes open and your ears to the ground for problems that could cause the candidate problems, right? So that's where this catch and kill stuff comes in. If someone is going to come forward with a story that would be problematic given the campaign, what the National Enquirer would do, and they did this with Karen McDougal, they did this with a doorman apparently who had a story about Trump that was negative, is they pay this person money and say, now we have a contract with you. We have the exclusive rights to your story. Now, the people who sign these agreements often think that that means their story is going to be published. I mean, Karen McDougal thought that her story was actually going to be published by the National Enquirer, and that's why they were buying it. But instead, what they were doing actually is they were buying it to kill it. They had the exclusive rights, meaning Karen McDougal could not go to another publication and sell her story to them. She couldn't tell anyone else about this. It was exclusive to the Enquirer, but they were not about to publish it because the whole purpose of the thing was to keep it quiet, given that the election was coming. So that was the scheme, and it becomes even more important, not just in 2015 when they hatched this whole thing, but in 2016, right as the election is just really about to happen. The Access Hollywood tape comes out. The campaign is on the ropes. Stormy Daniels comes forward and says, hey, I have something to say. And that's when they say, well, we've got to do this again, because if this comes to light right before the election, Trump will likely lose. So that's the connection to between catch and kill and the election, and ultimately the payments to Cohen, because he's the one who paid Daniels for the kill portion.
Right. Ultimately, that was part of the problem. Now, Nick, I mean, let's say hypothetically, if this catch and kill scheme had gone forward, but there was never any payment from, Michael Cohen involved here, would we even be talking about this case?
Well, no, because there wouldn't be a criminal case. I mean, it's just like if Richard Nixon, what he did was he kept telling the public he had no connection to the Watergate break-in, the White House had no connection. The crime was in the obstruction of justice. Here, the crime was in the falsification of documents to continue that cover-up. When the cover-up violates a criminal law, that's when you get into trouble. And that's what happened here, and that's what happened in Watergate.
Jessica, there was some interesting reporting from our reporters in the room about David Pecker, who has known Donald Trump for so long. He didn't really look at Trump when he was on the stand, but at some point, I think when he was leaving the stand, sort of waved at him or acknowledged him. I mean, this is an interesting dynamic where, Trump is, in a way, such a imposing figure in public. He's very unhappy about this trial happening. What do you think it's going to be like for him to have to sit there and listen to David Pecker, someone who's known basically forever, kind of tell all of his secrets?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think this is going to be incredibly difficult for Donald Trump. I mean, it's not with David Pecker. I mean, obviously this is someone he has a long friendship with. I think the photos that we've, just shown on the screen, I mean, this goes back a very long time, and these were much younger men in the beginning of those photos. And it's not just Pecker. I mean, it's also Michael Cohen. Obviously, there's been bad blood between them for years, but Cohen, Pecker, and Trump are people who had been friends for a very, very long time, had connections with each other for a very long time. To watch now these two people testify against him, I would imagine, if you've been friends with someone for decades, it'd be incredibly difficult.
And
one more thing.
Go ahead, Jennifer.
I was going to say, I think this is difficult for Pecker too, and this kind of raises another point. I'm really anxious to see how he does tomorrow because, he's there not by his own choice. He does have immunity, and some of this I think is going to come down to how well prosecutors prepared, how much they got out of him in the grand jury, because I'm wondering if he's going to be reluctant. He's sitting there in front of this old friend of his. He doesn't want to be there. He doesn't want to do this. I'm wondering if they're going to have to prompt him along and end up impeaching him with some of his previous testimony in the grand jury if he actually balks a little bit on the stand. I'm looking for that, actually. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, he does have immunity, Kelly. I mean, is there a risk here that he doesn't actually deliver on what he is supposed to say up there? And on top of that, if you could address this as well, his interrupted testimony today, it was a short court day today. It's going to be resuming tomorrow. How does that affect a witness's demeanor as they go up on the stand now for the second day in a row, and tomorrow we'll hear much more from him?
Well, to go to your first question, I mean, it could potentially, they might have to impeach him as well, but of what he said before to make sure. But he is definitely a key witness because it was at the beginning when this alleged conspiracy happened. And it goes back to what was their intent. And I think that's definitely going to be key. And so it's really important for him to establish that. So potentially, if he's humming and hawing, and then they can bring up, as was pointed out, his prior testimony that he did in the grand jury and trying to impeach him as well. But we also have to remember that he does have to testify truthfully as well, but he does have immunity for any potential charges for him. Now, going to your point about breaking it up, that could potentially, they might go back and kind of start over again. But initially, it was initial questions that they asked him, just kind of general information as well, and he seemed poised and calm during his testimony.
Yeah, probably knowing that it was going to be a short day. They want to save most of it for tomorrow when they have a longer stretch. Everyone stick around for us. A first for the former president with criminal charges on the line, how Donald Trump is handling it all on the inside and outside of the courtroom as well. That's next.
When we look back 100 years from now, we're going to say, this is where everything changed.
Hands in the sky. They can't do it like us.
We are talking about the revolution.
Music could make a difference.
The world fundamentally changed.
Clinton undermined himself.
America felt betrayed. 2010s have ushered in peak TV.
We keep moving too much. When it baby, it ain't no stopping. Keep your hands in the air, we keep on rocking.
Beyonce's new album is breaking records.
You ready?
Yeah, I can't wait. Somebody asks you, what are you? Do people ask you that sometimes?
I would just say American.
I would imagine it's hot in these robes. You know what they say, safety third.
I'm a disabled person, just like you're not a person with blackness.
I'm not trying to be confrontational. We're getting right into the details. I'm trying to be conversational.
Every weekday morning, CNN's 5 Things has what you need to get going with your day. It's the 5 essential stories of the morning in 5 minutes or less.
CNN's 5 Things with Kate Baldwin, streaming weekdays exclusively on Max.
Beyonce's new album is breaking records.
Every weekday morning, CNN's 5 Things has what you need to get going with your day. It's the 5 essential stories of the morning in 5 minutes or less.
CNN's 5 Things with Kate Baldwin, streaming weekdays exclusively on Max.
Whoa, let me back up for a minute.
It's beautiful. Wow. Look at this.
What I do for my art.
That's good, man.
Whoa, let me back up for a minute.
More salsa.
We do this for real.
We've heard all the pundits, seen all the hot takes, and read all the headlines. But what's it like to hear from the people actually living the news? I'm Audie Cornish, longtime journalist, and my CNN podcast will break down trending stories, the debates rocking our culture, and talk to the people living the headlines. I've got a lot of questions.
The Assignment with Audie Cornish. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Mad at the world, that is how one source described Donald Trump today. Inside of the court, he held back his visible frustrations, but outside, of course, he had plenty to say about today's witnesses and testimony, and about how the trial is cutting into his presidential campaign.
This is what took me off and takes me off the campaign trail, because I should be in Georgia now. I should be in Florida now. I should be in a lot of different places right now campaigning, and I'm sitting here. And this will go on for a long time. It's very unfair.
Another of the former president's frustrations is that he had restrictions placed on him by Judge Merchan in the form of a gag order, restricting what he can and cannot do, and what prosecutors argue, he's already violated it. Our CNN legal analysts are back with me, Nick Ackerman, Kelly Hyman, Jessica Washington, and Jennifer Rogers. Jessica, Trump obviously is frustrated. He is caged in a courtroom. He cannot go campaign. He cannot go do the things he wants to be doing. I should just note, he keeps violating this gag order. He knows there's a gag order. He keeps violating it almost every day at this point. What does it tell you about how this is going to go? I mean, he has nothing but frustrations to let out because he can't change that this trial is in fact happening.
I mean, look, Donald Trump has been railing against all of these charges the entire time, and he's not going to stop. I mean, I believe actually he compared his gag order to the plight of Nelson Mandela. So that kind of tells you how things are going around here. But I think he's really testing the limits of the system. I mean, we have never had a former president have to sit for a criminal trial. And I think he knows that the system is stretched to its limit, trying to understand what can I really do to rein in a former president and the Republican nominee for president. It's an unprecedented situation, and he is definitely testing the limits of the system.
Kelly, one of the interesting things that our reporters noticed in the room, when that excerpt of the Access Hollywood tape was being read, Trump was pretty stoic up until that point. Then he passed a note to his attorneys. He leaned in to whisper to one of them. Jury noticing all of that, you think?
Absolutely. I mean, when you talk about a trial, a lot of times people compare it to a theater or a stage, that everything that the going on, that the juries are watching, they're seeing all this stuff, watching people's mannerisms when they take the witness stand, how they're acting, watching their hand movements, watching how people react to it. Absolutely. And so that's definitely going to be key, because they're watching all this and they're seeing all this. And Trump is aware of that. He knows that as someone who's been in the public eye, that the people are watching him, the jurors are watching him, how he handles it, how he handled when the state stood up and made their arguments, and then how when his attorney stood up and did his opening statement, how he was watching and the way he handled that. Absolutely. The jury's watching all this, and seeing how he interacts towards this is definitely key.
Nick, I wonder what you think about Trump's behavior in those moments. If part of the deal here, the prosecutors are arguing, is that the Access Hollywood tape, the allegations about Stormy Daniels were things that he believed were so damaging to him that he was willing to essentially commit a crime to cover it up, does his behavior seem to suggest that something got under his skin just to hear it played back to him?
Well, you haven't seen anything yet. This was just the opening statements. All we heard were the lawyers on both sides laying out what their case would be. Wait till you see the witnesses get up on the stand. Wait until David Pecker gets into the hardcore meeting and the conversations that he had with Donald Trump, gets into hearing about the tape that Michael Cohen recorded in order to assure David Pecker that Donald Trump would still pay the $150,000 back to him for Karen McDougal. I mean, there is so much that's going to come out in the course of this trial from the next few witnesses that I just don't see how Donald Trump's going to be able to contain himself.
Speaking of containing himself, or lack thereof, Jennifer, let me just play for you what Trump said as he left the courtroom today.
He is a lawyer, or was a lawyer, and also the things he got in trouble for were things that had nothing to do with me. He got in trouble, he went to jail. This had nothing to do with me. This had to do with the taxi cab company that he owned, which is just something he owned, and medallions and borrowing money and a lot of things, but it had nothing to do with me.
First of all, Jennifer, I mean, do you think that that was effectively a violation of the gag order? I mean, and look, he's in court now. This is no longer jury selection. This is no longer any pretrial stuff. I mean, he is facing a jury. If you are Donald Trump's attorney and he's doing this every single day, what are you thinking?
Yeah. So to the first question, is it a violation? So the order says that you cannot make public statements about witnesses concerning their potential participation in the criminal proceeding. So that's really the question. To the extent that he's commenting on the credibility of Michael Cohen, that I think implicates his participation in the proceeding. Like tomorrow morning, we're going to have the hearing where Judge Merchan is going to determine how many times, if any, Trump has violated this order and then decide what to do about it. This probably is a violation, but honestly, Abby, there's so many others. I mean, I think there were 10 before he went into the hallway today, so the judge will have his hands full trying to decide what to do, and he doesn't have great options. It's a $1,000 fine per or 30 days in jail, but no one thinks that he's going to go there yet. And as for his lawyer, I mean, I was struck by watching Todd Blanche standing next to Trump. And listen, this is Trump. I don't know that anyone can do anything about it or, risk getting fired, but he doesn't try to do anything. He doesn't put a hand on him. He doesn't lean over and whisper in his ear. I mean, it's ironic that when he wanted the list of witnesses coming up, the order, and what if I promise you that there won't be any tweets? It's like you don't have any control over your client. He's not even attempting to control his client. And maybe he doesn't feel like he can, but certainly he is not controlling him. So I'm very anxious to see what the judge says about all this tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean, I think he knows what the consequences of doing something like that would be when it comes to Trump. Trump does not want to be reined in. He thinks he's his own best attorney and perhaps own best spokesperson as well. Everyone, once again, stick around. We've got a lot more coming up. And it's not just tomorrow's testimony. The gag order surrounding Trump will take center stage, as we've been discussing. We'll tell you what to expect. That's next.
Beyonce's new album is breaking records.
Every weekday morning, CNN's 5 Things has what you need to get going with your day. It's the 5 essential stories of the morning in 5 minutes or less.
CNN's 5 Things with Kate Baldwin, streaming weekdays exclusively on Max.
Whoa, let me back up for a minute.
It's beautiful. Wow. Look at this.
What I do for my art.
That's good, man.
Whoa, let me back up for a minute.
More salsa.
We do this for real.
We've heard all the pundits, seen all the hot takes, and read all the headlines. But what's it like to hear from the people actually living the news? I'm Audie Cornish, longtime journalist, and my CNN podcast will break down trending stories, the debates rocking our culture, and talk to the people living the headlines. I've got a lot of questions.
The Assignment with Audie Cornish. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
There is no media personality, businesswoman, celebrity chef like her.
The Many Lives of Martha Stewart, now streaming on Max.
This is an incredible story. The stakes were extremely high.
I believe you are the Son of God.
His election is an earthquake.
He transcends the church.
I have chosen to stay and fight.
He said, I'm not getting in this to lose.
The sky was the limit.
On the Chasing Life podcast, Dr. Sanjay Gupta goes inside the world of weight loss, the new miracle drugs, and what weight really tells us about our health. Chasing Life with Dr. Sanjay Gupta. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
You are not broken.
They just need a place to be heard.
The people who may not have a loud voice, nevertheless have an important story to tell. And there's a responsibility in telling their stories accurately. There is hope. Their trust in me means everything.
Well, the hush money trial of Donald Trump will continue tomorrow. I want to bring back in my panel. The hearing resumes tomorrow. There are potential violations of Trump's gag order that is on the agenda. You've got David Pecker taking the stand. Each one of you, I'll go around, starting with you, Nick. What should we expect tomorrow?
Well, I think what you're going to see with David Pecker is he really sets the stage for the entire scheme. He doesn't really get into the actual criminal part that relates to the falsification of records, but he does set up the overall scheme and the overall players that are involved in the scheme, including Michael Cohen, including Donald Trump, and the various people who had information on Donald Trump that they tried to cover up. In addition to that, David Pecker is the perfect witness to come before Michael Cohen, because he basically sets up an automatic corroboration in support of Michael Cohen's testimony, in the sense that people are going to hear what happened before Michael Cohen even testifies. And third, you're going to hear about that tape and about why that was important, which will also go into Michael Cohen's testimony.
What about you, Kelly? What are you looking for?
the gag order to see if in fact the judge makes a determination that the gag order was violated, and what kind of penalties is it going to be? Is it going to be monetary in jail time or strictly monetary? And is that going to change the gag order? Is there going to be modifications to it? Or if it, in fact, there was some type of penalty, or next time it happens or supposedly happened, is it going to be greater for monetary damages?
And Jessica?
Yeah, I have to agree with Nick. For me, it's all eyes on David Pecker. I think we've been hearing from Michael Cohen for years talk about this situation, rail against Donald Trump, to finally hear from the other person in this equation, part of this three-person group, I think is going to be critical to this case. So I'm really invested in hearing what Pecker has to say.
And Jennifer?
I think it's eyes on Donald Trump, too. Picking up on something Nick said earlier, he's boiling, right? And I want to see how he acts when Pecker really gets into the, Trump said this, we agreed to this was about the election. It's going to get more and more heated, I think, as time goes on, and that's going to start when Pecker really gets into the heart of this. I want to see how Trump handles it.
Yeah, I mean, look, from a political perspective, this case is really the opening salvo of all of Trump's legal woes. And we cannot forget it's happening in the middle of a presidential election. So all these things that people probably forgot, there are probably some voters who weren't even eligible to vote back in 2016, maybe hearing this for the very first time and really unearthing some of these dark secrets that Donald Trump wanted to hide pretty badly. Nick Ackerman, Kelly Hyman, Jessica Washington, and Jennifer Rogers. A great hour spent with all of you. Thank you very much for joining us. And thank you for joining me tonight. I'm Abby Phillip. You are watching our special coverage of the Trump criminal trial on CNN Max. We are streaming here 24/7. Our coverage continues with Laura Coates after a short break.